Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and believe it or not, I am finally back with a review. It's been like at least over a year, I believe, since I uploaded a review. However, I am back. Let's see if I still know how to review books. You tell me at the end in the comments down below. But there's actually a very specific reason why I'm filming this review right now, which the review is of Arrows of the Queen by Mercedes Lackey, which is the first book in the Heralds of Valdemar trilogy, or the Arrows trilogy, I've also seen it called, which is the first trilogy that was published within the entire Valdemar universe. I'll get to that whole thing later when I explain what the book is about. And that is that a couple of weeks ago, Mercedes Lackey / her team reached out to me because they currently have a backer kit project going to fund a deluxe edition of this trilogy and wanted to see if I was interested in sharing the information. And they said that in return they could provide me with a digital copy of what the project is going to be, because obviously they haven't been printed yet, the books, and also so I could talk about the qualities of what the physical books are going to be like. They would send me the previous project, which is the Grandmaster Deluxe Edition. However, that one is not going to arrive here until the backer kit is already over, so yeah. I said that I would share the information, which I'm going to do. However, that I would be honest in my opinions on the first book, which is all that I'm able to read, or that I can get around to reading before the backer kit is over. I'll tell you all the information on the backer kit at the end of the video. However, if you just want to quickly look at it, I will also leave the link down below, obviously. But yeah, Arrows of the Queen. What is the book about? What did I think of it? Obviously, Mercedes Lackey is like, you know, one of the big names within the fantasy genre. If you dive even just a little bit deeper within the fantasy genre, I believe I got the information that she has published over 100 books, and the Valdemar series or universe on its own. I just very quickly looked at the wiki and I saw that I think there's at least over 40 books, and that's not counting like short stories or anthologies or anything along those lines. So massive universe, and as such Mercedes Lackey has been on my radar for a while. I've been thinking about getting to her, however without this it probably would have still taken a while. And so yeah, I'm very excited that I got around to the first book, Arrows of the Queen, which is not chronologically the first within the universe. However, it was the first one published. It was published back in the 80s. And in it we follow a young girl, Talia, who is about to be married off because she is quite too unruly for her people. And so she runs away and meets a horse, a so-called companion, and those companions are basically the companions of the magical companions of the protectors of the realm, the so-called heralds. And so she goes off on that horse and becomes a herald because she was chosen to be the herald of this specific companion. And not only that, she also has to be a very special herald, because whoever is the herald of said companion becomes the so-called queen's own, so the personal herald of the Queen of Valdemar. And as such, she goes to the Collegium where she learns how to be a herald, and there's a bunch of stuff happening that really overwhelms her. And yeah, it just kind of follows her story, this first book, in the first few years at the Collegium. So, I will, as always, in my reviews start with the negative stuff and end with the positive stuff. However, I will have a big part within this review in the middle where I talk about certain choices, I guess, or characteristics of this book, because this is classic fantasy, more classic fantasy. And classic fantasy has some very specific things about it that might not be what every modern fantasy reader is looking for. And so you kind of have to go into classic fantasy with a very much different mindset than you have to go into modern fantasy. So I will just talk about some of that stuff within the middle of the review, like between the negatives and the positives. Negatives wise, there's one main thing that I just personally didn't enjoy. That I don't know if it's just a product of its time. Again, this book was written in the 80s, so different stuff in books might have been more normalized than it is now. But the thing that made me really uncomfortable is how casual corporal punishment of children was. And just like how casually it was talked about. And very much in a way where it's not like, okay, these characters are not perfect characters and this is something that just is normal within the character, kind of. But it really did feel like it was written about in a, this is not even something we have to consider or think about way. And that's because like a big part of the story was also Talia having to kind of tame the queen's heir, who is quite the brat. And in that regard, corporal punishment was used a couple of times and in a very casual way. In a way where it's like, this is all good, this is fine, this is dandy. And I'm just not a fan of that. You know, my modern sensibilities kind of very much, or I don't like that. So also be aware of that, if that might be something that you struggle with in terms of triggers or anything along those lines going into this book. However, that really was the main thing that I would say is like a solid negative about the book. A lot of the other things in this book were things that maybe I personally didn't enjoy that much, or I personally don't prefer in my books. However, they're not things where I would say this is, you know, on the book, it's more so on me. Like for example, Arrows of the Queen, very much, I would say it, well, going by modern standards would be at least YA, if not middle grade. I personally do not enjoy YA or middle grade that much anymore. As such, I did have a harder time just fully getting relaxed into the story, I would say, or just getting fully immersed in the story, because yeah, as I said, it's not really what I prefer reading anymore. However, I don't know how much of that continues on. Like for example, also when you look at the Green Rider series by Kristen Britton, the first book very much is YA. However, as the series goes on, it becomes more and more adult. So I don't know how much of that would also be the case with the Heralds of Valdemar, that we follow Talia as she's growing up, and so the series is going to become more and more adult. So I don't know, I would put this first book between middle grade and YA. The main character is 13 to 16 years old. However, I don't know how much of that will remain as we're going forward. Also, if you treat this as a middle grade book, be aware that there still is talk of sex. Not graphically, and in a lot of ways it's more like characters failing to have sex because they constantly fall asleep because they're so fucking tired. But yeah, it's there. So be aware of that also. Another thing that I appreciate, but I'm also aware of that it might not be something that everyone enjoys, is that this is written very much like a more classic fantasy series. The book, at least in this copy, has 200 pages. That's not a lot of pages. As such, there's a lot of, you know, time jumping, and also quite a bit of telling, not showing. However, not in the way that we usually experience it with more modern fantasy. But I don't know how to explain it exactly, but there's this very specific way that classic fantasy does a lot of telling that I don't really mind, because it's very much like a tale being told, right? So also, for example, like if you think of Lord of the Rings, if you think of Jenny Ward's Wars of Shadow and Light, there is also a lot of telling in those books, because there's, I wouldn't say there's less character focus, but the way we focus on the internals of characters within modern fantasy is just very different from classic fantasy. And so in that regard, this book very much is a classic fantasy story. It also covers a lot of tropes. Like, if you want to read this book, I'm pointing down there as if I have it laying here. I don't. If you want to read this book, do not expect to be massively surprised by the plot. Like, it's not about, you know, having these crazy plot twists or anything along those lines. There's a lot of stuff happening, but this first book specifically, while there is a lot of politics going on in the background, this first book follows Talia as she sets herself up at the Collegium, and it's more so about her personal progression within the Collegium and how that also influences the politics of this kingdom, because she is the queen's own, rather than focusing on the politics specifically. So yeah, they're just, you know, kind of like this middle part of the review, I would say, just be very, very aware. This is a classic fantasy. If you don't enjoy classic fantasy, I don't think you will enjoy this book. And so for me also, when I read classic fantasy, I go into it with a very specific mindset. And so a lot of times, like, if I read this book just not knowing it's classic fantasy, just picking it up, not gonna lie, personally, I probably would have not enjoyed it that much. I would have thought a lot of the things were quite surface level, there was a lot of jumping around, etc. However, when I read classic fantasy, something I do a lot is just like not reading it for how well it holds up or anything along those lines, which I think this book does hold up very well, aside from the corporal punishment bit, but I'll get to that later. But the mindset that I go into classic fantasy with is just appreciating it for its own, for what it is, and anything that comes additional to that is just a plus. Now to the things that I very much did solidly like. I really enjoyed Talia as a character. I thought that she was set up incredibly. I thought that while I'm certain that a more modern fantasy would have lingered more on her trauma and again gone more into like the internalized struggles a lot, this book was incredible in terms of how it dealt with Talia's history. Talia's history is also that she has experienced a lot of violence, not sexual violence necessarily, I think, but generally violence from men. As such, she, at the beginning of the story, is very weary and very scared of men, and just like having her slowly warm up to male colleagues is done really well, I think. In general, also just explaining or arguing the way that she thinks with her history, which leads to a lot of trouble. Like, especially at the beginning of the story, Talia very much shuts all other people out because she doesn't trust people, and that leads to certain experiences, but then also reasons why people love her, for example. All of that I thought was really, really well done. Talia was set up very solidly as the main character. So the story isn't about what's going on around, it's very much about her. However, in parts we do also get POVs from other characters and how they view her, which I thought added to the story as well. And so just seeing her slowly come out of her shell, I did really appreciate and I did really enjoy. And then the last thing that I just really liked about the book is this was written in '87. Queerness is very casual in here. There are multiple sapphic, specifically characters. However, there's also mention, I believe, of some gay characters or gay men. And there is also mention of societies where queerness is normal. However, it isn't within Valdemar. So within Valdemar, queerness very much is still frowned upon, even though it is somewhat accepted. So it's not criminalized, however, it is frowned upon. And just seeing all of that in a book from the 80s is just really not surprising, because I knew it was gonna be in there, but I just really appreciate it. You know what I mean? So yeah. Overall, funnily enough, I mentioned Green Rider. Green Rider and the Heralds of Valdemar have almost exactly the same setup, in that you have a girl who is chosen for some reason by a horse companion who then goes and joins a special elite group of people who are also somewhat warriors, although in this one it's mainly messengers. In the other one it's like warriors and spies, and just like, you know, they have to go out every now and again for the kingdom. I personally prefer this one. However, I do think if you read Arrows of the Queen first and then this one, it might also be the other way around. It's just very much the same setup. Like, I do not doubt that Kristen Britain was inspired by the Heralds of Valdemar. The setup is very similar, however the characters like Kerrigan and Talia are two completely different characters, and their strengths and weaknesses are also very different from each other. But yeah, that was it for the review part. I don't know what I would give the first book. I kind of often have a hard time, similar to classics, also giving books a rating where, you know, my enjoyment isn't solely hinged on the contents of the books, but also just like the context of how it came to be, or like the context in which it was written. So yeah, don't really know what I would give it, probably around 3.5 stars. I will continue on with the series, definitely. I will continue on probably next month. Both the second and the third book aren't that long. However, within June, I do now want to continue on focusing on like very, very queer books, you know. Not that this book wasn't queer also, but solidly queer books, I would say. By the way, the queerness, I do genuinely mean it when I say it's like there a lot. Like, it's some of the main side characters that are queer. It's not just like mentioned off to the side at some point, as I have come across more often. And so now for the backer kit, there are a bunch of different stretch goals, as always with the backer kit. I will have the links down below, as I said. It goes still until June 27th. And as far as I can see from the information, just like very quickly, also I will put up, you know, a picture of what it's gonna look like over here. There are a bunch of paintings inside. There's like art inside. I did see some of the art already and it's absolutely gorgeous. I really enjoy the art style. I'm gonna try and put one up over here. I think I already mentioned there's a bunch of different stretch goals. However, the two main like ways to back it, as far as I can see, is with $25, which is the Music of Valdemar and digital art pack only. And then if you want the deluxe Heralds of Valdemar series, then it's $125. I personally have never backed via backer kit, only via Kickstarter, so I don't know, I assume this also doesn't include shipping. And then also, I don't know, as I said, it's until the 27th. I know that with Kickstarter, sometimes it's possible to still back stuff after the Kickstarter was over, basically, actually via backer kit, so do a late pledge. I don't know if that's possible with backer kit. But yeah, if the copy that I'm gonna get still pops up before the end of the campaign, then I will probably upload a video on TikTok sharing all the qualities of the book with you. However, as it is, sadly, I cannot share it. And yeah, with all of that, tell me in the comments down below, have you read The Heralds of Valdemar? What did you think of it? If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media, also all the links to the book clubs that I run / am in will also be linked down below. And I hope I'll see you very soon. Bye!